Hello, everybody. I am really sorry that I cannot be there in person, but I hope at least this recording does some way or goes some way, does something to compensate for the circumstances which have meant that I couldn't be there. I'm really sorry. Again, I have some resources at the end of this, and I have shared the slide with the organisers. So hopefully you can just listen. And if there's things here that pique your curiosity about story completion, you've got places to go and ask questions, even though they're not of me in person. I'm Jenny Braun. I'm in the School of Psychology at Waipapa Tamataro, the University of Auckland. I am going to talk a little bit about what qualitative story completion is, give you a bit of context for where it sits, and then also talk about what it might offer, health research, and when and why we might use it as an approach broadly and loosely. The first thing I want to do, sorry about that, is contextualize qualitative story completion within wider qualitative scholarship. Qualitative research is fundamentally grounded in wanting to get at meaning and understanding. There's lots more, but if I was asked to kind of crystallize this into two words, meaning and understanding of what I'd say, but I'd also add interpretation. And these things are often developed through the generation of data that has been produced for our research. This is traditionally through processes of presenting people with some kind of stimulus, questions in the form of often an interview or a focus group, and increasingly other things like qualitative surveys and so on, and seeking responses that are based on the respondents' experience, their knowledge, their perspectives, and so on. Much qualitative research, both in health and across the wider social sciences, deploys these types of messages, these types of methods. Sorry. And, here's an example from a nursing journal that I just looked up to see, is this still the case? And, there's nothing wrong with that. So my talk is not going to suggest that these are inappropriate to get at the knowledge we want to get at. Such knowledge is both generated from to represent the meaning frames, the perspectives, the experiences of those participants, and can be theorized from both essentialist or realist perspectives through to more critical and constructionist ways. And it has given us a wealth of information about how people experience their worlds, make sense of them, engage with things like health-related things on all sorts of different levels. So they are hugely important and hugely valuable in context. But these approaches to knowledge and knowledge production can be, I'm having mouse issues, sorry, can be contrasted and sometimes combined with a wide range of other approaches, including generative, I'm so sorry, I'm not usually that technically chaotic. I'm going to move my keyboard out of the way because I keep pressing on it. They can be contrasted and sometimes combined with these array of approaches that include generative, participatory, and creative ones. So creative approaches are a diverse and expanding array of methodologies, sometimes situated within new materialist or post-humanistic orientations around data production, and I'm using that in scare quotes, but I am going to use it, which include creative and artistic variation of methods, a whole range of methods that generate data in non-word form. So examples might include drawing or embroidering or crafting or mapping or photography and much more. And sometimes these also include words, but words are not necessarily the sole or the primary purpose of them. Deborah Lupton, a health sociologist who some of you may know, whose work deploys increasingly creative approaches, described why she uses these approaches in this way. I have recently begun to experiment with novel methods based on design research and arts-based approaches, using these methods on which to delve into the taken for granted elements of seeking and generating health information that may be useful, that may be difficult for research participants to articulate in standard interviews or focus group discussions. These elements include embodied sensory or affective responses to health or ill health states, which can sometimes be difficult for people to bring to mind or articulate when directly asked about. This can be because these embodied experiences and feelings are such a mundane part of people's experiences, because they can be difficult to put into words, or because they are considered so personal, poignant, or sensitive that research participants do not necessarily want to discuss them with, with researchers. So I think Deborah Lupton articulates why the focus on self-report is kind of being moved beyond by many who are interested in things related to health. So within the broad domain of creative methods, we can situate storytelling methods. Those are creative because they draw on different skills and knowledge and produce different products to the more typical self-report centered methods of social sciences. And storytelling, of course, I'm going to talk more about it in a moment, but I would say qualitative social, it says social completion up on my slide, which has completely distracted me. It should say qualitative story completion. Is a relatively creative light version of this, retaining creativity in the sense that it gives participants interpretative freedom and possibility, but light in the sense that it doesn't demand artistic or creative skill sets that people may not feel they have or may feel that they are bad at. And it connects in some ways, albeit possibly lightly, to the oral and storytelling traditions of various cultures, including various Indigenous cultures, although at this point, I would also note the caveat that some people have raised questions, and I think these are very important questions, about the extent to which the method which and we are mostly all white scholars operating in Western scholarly contexts, have explored the use of the method. And so the questions have been asked about the extent to which the method is specifically culturally bound within Western cultural frames. And I think that's an important consideration. I'm not going to go into any more detail about that, but given the context, I think that's also a really important aspect to think about. We don't want to kind of just assume a kind of epistemological dominance and assume that this is relevant. So let's move on to story completion. And I am going to start with a couple of examples of the task that participants get presented with before I get into the more details of the method. So what does it actually look like? So here's an example from a project we did in 2020. This was a UK and a New Zealand-based collaboration. Like the rest of the country, Alex has been under significant COVID-19 restrictions for a while and is feeling frustrated and cooped up. As tomorrow is going to be a warm and sunny day, Alex is thinking about going for a drive to the beach 30 minutes from their home. Please continue the story of Alex and write about what happens next. There are no limits to the scope of your story, but we ask you to consider these 3 elements. Alex's decision-making process, what decision Alex reaches, in inverted commas, and the outcomes or consequences of that. And here's another one, again from a health-related project. Chris has decided to eat healthily, but needs some clear guidelines to do this. After some online research and talking to friends, Chris is ready to start. Please write a story of at least 200 words. The scope of your story is completely open, except that we would like to include something about Chris's rationale and decisions around eating healthily and what healthy eating involves for Chris and any outcomes or consequences. Please use your own current knowledge to write this story. Please do not search for information on other websites to write the story. That last little bit of instruction was something we added after our first round of piloting, made us realize that it sounded like some participants had simply Googled healthy eating and then put their responses in. And this was pre-generative AI, so now it would be, dear ChatGPT, please write a story about Chris and healthy eating. So we want to avoid that. And story completion offers a mostly written way to then generate these qualitative data. It is mostly written in response to a written stimulus, which is the story stem, which I've just shown, and it can generate really rich data sets, even if the stories themselves are often relatively brief and relatively mundane. So I thought I'd give you an example of a couple of stories from those stems that I just read. So here's an Alex story. Remember, this is about COVID lockdowns and in the context of the UK and New Zealand, where we were having significant restrictive lockdowns. Alex conjured up the image in his mind. He could feel the sun on his blue/white skin, which had been covered up all winter, could taste the salt on his lips, could feel the milky sea air caressing his body, could hear the waves, the sense of well-being washed over him, but not for long. His tendency for fearing the worst took hold. He pictured being stopped on the motorway and having to explain he'd actively chosen to make non-essential travel to a disapproving police officer. He imagined breaking down and needing to call for roadside assistance. He tried to imagine the chances of catching it or spreading it, but while that just felt so far-fetched and ridiculous, he knew it was possible. And this possibility, this fear made up his mind. No, there was no way. It could remain a dream, be something to look forward to. Another day in the back garden would be fine. At least he had a garden, he told himself. There were plenty of others who were in a far worse position. So that's a COVID story. And here's a healthy eating story for Chris. For Chris, he decided to look further into healthy eating to optimize his health in general and improve his energy levels. In his research, he focused on these areas of improvement, searching up foods with high calorie content that were still healthy to keep him sustained through his long and taxing day. He realized that the change his diet required had to be quite drastic to meet these requirements. As a busy university student, in the past, he relied mostly on takeaways and campus store foods in the name of convenience. However, following his research, he has begun to put in more effort into meal planning at home and bringing packed lunches to university instead. This allows him to make healthier decisions, such as having a lean meat sandwich and fruits, as opposed to pies and cookies from takeaways. Pies in New Zealand are not pies in the Canadian context. They are savoury, usually meat-filled pastry pockets. As Chris continued to talk to his friends about it, he got more and more ideas for ways he could eat healthier despite his busy schedule. Had he not done this on the days he was very short of time, he would have had to once again start eating unhealthy campus foods. However, talking to his friends gave him insight into hidden stores on campus that are very health-oriented, such as smoothie, wrap, salad bars, and sushi restaurants. So the examples I've selected are relatively mundane ones, nothing special or unusual about them from the data set. But the stories can be amazing. They can be humorous, and they often are. And they can be effectively and psychologically rich. In a study of online dating around COVID, and Gibson and BT noted that the very method of story completion was inevitably going to gather stories from participants that would range from the dramatic to humorous to wildly creative, what with instructions asking participants not to relate personal experiences and be as creative as they liked. So this connects to another aspect of qualitative story, which is that it can potentially be quite a fun task for participants. They can be as creative as they like. And what we have found across multiple projects that we do get entirely fantastical stories sometime. And I'm going to show you one. I'll put it up, but I'll also read it. And it has humor, but it also has pathos and sadness within it. And it does mention death. Jane has decided to stop removing body hair. At the start, there was no difference, but after 3 days, she finds that the hair on her legs and oxtra is growing too fast. Just 2 days, or it's already 5 centimeters long. This is about Jane, who decided to stop removing her body hair. Sorry, I should have mentioned that at the start. She realized that maybe it is because she is always removing the hair, so it can make the hair grow faster and bolder. But she already decided to stop removing her body hair, and winter is coming. She doesn't need to wear vests and shorts, so nobody's going to see it. After 2 weeks, she finds the hair is still growth. It is already 20 centimeters long. It is still hair, but not the normal hair. Actually, she's trying to remove the hair when she found the hair is still growing after 10 centimeters. It is already too long. She can feel it every time she is walking and moving the arm, as well as the hair on her upper leg. It is not long, but it's hard, like needles. So she decided to remove it. But when she cut the armpit hair, she feels pain. It is no longer hair. It is becoming something like shredded meat with hair looking, but it's bleeding when she cut it. The shank feathering is so hard. So she used to have so she had to use garden shears to cut it. She can't go out in the school or the street or in any public place. She just stays at home lies on the bed, the shank feathering making lots of small punctures on her sheet and quilt. She locks herself in the room. Nobody can come in. After 1 month, the landlord comes to her room to ask for her rental fee, but nobody answers. So the landlord opens the room. The whole room is filled with a variety of hair, a straight, curved, soft, and hard. And there they move around and sweep the room. They're attached to a dry body on the bed. There's so much I could say about this, but we have published a story about the women stopping removing body hair, and it's in the references at the end, I believe, or if it's not, it's on our website. But even though the story is entirely fantastical, the ideas contained within it are ones that relate to the more realistic stories. So what else is story completion? It is, importantly, a projective technique. And by that, I mean participants aren't asked their views or perspectives, unlike conventional social science qualitative research. Instead, they're given something that they have to interpret and make sense of in whatever way they decide. And the framing of these as projective techniques stems from the history of the method. So let's have a little look about that. Projectives were initially developed within psychoanalytic clinical practice, where participants were presented with an ambiguous stimulus, like the famous Rorschach ink blots or the drawings of the thematic apperception test, and asked to develop an account of what they were presented with, which was then interpreted as a way of revealing their deep psychology. One key aspect of projectives has been their ambiguity and interpretability. And this has been retained as a key element of story completion, where aspects of the stem need to be ambiguous or interpretable, and where they need to have interpretative options or variability available to them. And we've tried some studies with story completion that have really failed, where there was no sort of variability interpretative outcome. So that's an important consideration, although you can't always know that ahead of time. The method went on to be used in attachment research and psychology as a quantitative tool, but here I'm interested in its qualitative development and history. So how did it become a qualitative method? Well, the first kind of real use, I guess, of it was by feminist psychologist Marina Horner in the early 1970s. Marina was interested in, or did a study on medical students and examined women medical students' supposed fear of success in using story completion. She presented them with a scenario, and male and female med students described the students' feelings very differently, like what would happen for this top scoring medical student. And Marina Horner used sort of psychoanalytic interpretations, which framed the women's accounts as a fear of success and kind of positioned female medical students as being held back by this inner psychology rather than the sexist and misogynistic context of medical school training at the time. And there was quite a significant backlash to this research, which positioned her research as victim blaming rather than a sort of feminist interpretation of restrictive contexts. And it was one of the few uses of the method that really then kind of went into dormancy in the 80s and 90s, only to be picked up in the late 90s by Celia Kitzinger and a student, Deborah Powell, who experimented with the method in the mid-90s, exploring meaning making around an apparent infidelity. And there was the odd subsequent use of the method. And then in the early 2010s, a few of us started to get more collectively interested, exploring the method and thinking about what it could do. And it led to the formation of the Story Completion Research Group at UWE in the UK, the University of the West of England, with a few people like myself not there. And where our goal really was to play around with it, and there's been a subsequent increasing use of it across different approaches. So I really want to kind of acknowledge the various members of the Story Completion Research Group at UWE and other places. And we have a website which is woefully out of date. It's it's far down my to-do list of things to update it, but it still has a lot of resources there. And I guess the sort of point is to sort of now focus on, why did we get curious? Why were we excited by the potential of this method? So many of us are in psychology or counseling research, and I think that's important. Not that that's been the use of it over the course of its kind of exploration, but we are kind of psychologists in some shape or form. Many of us are critical psychologists, so we don't really feel like we're psychologists in the way many people think of psychology. So why did we get excited and interested? I think partly because stories don't require our participants' opinions or perspectives. And so our selves are not at stake in the stories we provide. And so we circumvent some of the issues of accountability that we might otherwise have to navigate around social desirability and so more. And what we've found in playing around is that stories completion can often get at the unsayable or the different stories than we might find in more conventional self-report methods. So in some of the body hair research with Jane, we found that there was much more of an emphasis on the effort and hassle of hair removal for women than we typically normally get in body hair research. And in research, we're still analysing around disability, physical disability, specifically wheelchair use, and sex and dating. We found that a lot of the stories people wrote about articulated things that people might not say out loud, but nonetheless reflect significant ableist assumptions and problematic accounts of wheelchair users. Telling stories requires sense-making practices. It requires participants to draw on those things, to construct something plausible. And that's a very different task to providing an answer from personal interpretation or personal experience. And the final reason, I guess, is that stories are part of our human worlds. Humans have a deep connection to stories, and so the method resonated with us. And stories have been key in meaning making across cultures, but they're also a key part of qualitative research from very early on within the narrative tradition. And narrative research is not exactly story research, but it does orient to and align with the storied nature of humanness. And it's, I guess, story completion is connected into a narrative. It's not a narrative frame, and it's not oral storytelling either as other traditions. So what is the contemporary story completion approach? Before I get to that, I was going to just also sort of highlight the way stories are specifically part of health research. So stories we know are part of the sense making around health and illness. They are connected into the identity transformation that often is and needs to be part of illness or experiences related to illness. There is a lot of research on illness narrative and a whole range of different types of approaches. And particularly, this is kind of connected into narrative research traditions within the health and illness space as well. But I'm not particularly focused on story completion as health method per se, but I just wanted to kind of signal those connections for those who might be doing using kind of narrative or story approaches within health. And I think there are a range of different possible connections that none of us have really explored yet, and I think there's a rich potential for those. So contemporary qualitative story completion is still a new method. There is an increasing range of use across different disciplines, using different designs and drawing on quite different conceptual frameworks, but it is still new, so it's still quite exploratory, and there's a lot of potential to play around with that. I won't go into any depth about that because I feel I will run over time if I do. I will get distracted. But I want to focus really on a key issue which is how do we theorize story data? There are a range of different ways we can theorize this, but this is really fundamental to doing the research and doing it well. And thinking about this is important because it's not obvious. And there's no sort of single likely way to interpret it. And the things that we have to account for and take into account and think about are different if we're theorizing our data in different ways. So I'm going to touch on a few of these in a bit more depth. The early uses of story completion, and potentially some still, were psychoanalytic. They sought to go into the heads of the writer to reveal the inner truths, their motivations, their unconscious, what might be guiding the stories that they told, as in Marina Horner's research on medical students. Other reads within qualitative reads were essentially essentialist ones, framed within the interior psychological truths and structures of the reader, the writer of these stories. But it's also been deployed within more critical realist frameworks as a contextualist method for getting at socially embedded perceptions of understandings. The fourth way that story completion data could be read, which was proposed by Kitzinger and Powell, is a constructionist read. They argue that instead of reading stories as revealing the inner psychology of writers, we could theorize and understand the stories as reflecting the meaning-making worlds that people have access to, the things that shape what's possible to imagine and write. And in their exploration of the method, Kitzinger and Powell showed that both essentialist and constructionist interpretations of the stories were defensible, were plausible. We just had to do the work to show how and why they were defensible. And as a constructionist, typically, scholar, I've been really fascinated in noting how even those stories which are framed as fantastical, like the Jane one that I read you earlier, often evidence the same tropes and ideas as the more plausible stories. And that, to me, validates the sense that we are getting at people's meaning-making and sociocultural resources through the method that we use. And finally, more recently, some scholars have explored the possibility of using story completion data within new materialist approaches, engaging, as Gibson and Beattie said, a feminist new materialism additionally involves a focus not just on language and discourse, but also on the materiality and agency of the physical world that shapes people's experiences, bodies, and their being in the world. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on these approaches, not as much as I would have if I were there in person, but to just give you a bit of a sense of how different they are. And I'll give you an example of the different types of research, but I've put up the references and you can go and read these yourselves and have a think about it. So essentialist perspectives are about getting at the writer's inner truths. And so Livingston and Tester's research, quite early research, looked at how women, I guess, perceive ambiguous sexual risk cues and decision makings. And so they presented a scenario which, you know, could be considered to kind of raise some red flags. And what they found in women's stories, that across the stories, women suggested that they could manage or limit any risk, and they didn't prioritize their own sort of sexual safety, but they prioritized the kind of relational, I guess, risk that was involved. And they argued that, or interpreted the stories that women wrote as reflecting the women's thoughts and feelings and so on. And so they assumed that there was, I guess, a real world relationship between the way women wrote stories and what they would do in the real world, should they be presented with these types of scenarios, which unfortunately we know are still far too common. But yeah, essentialist approach, get at the writer's inner truth. Similar to essentialist orientations, contextualist frameworks orient to how participants can understand and read the world and perceive the world, but they theorize these as real and meaningful for the storytellers, but also shaped by social context and location. So not as revealing kind of inner psychoanalytic or inner psychology, decontextualized. These are contextualized psychologies. So in this research, which looked at from Moller and Tishner, which looked at young people's perceptions of fat counsellors, they were interested in making sense of this in a wide context of deep anti-fat bias, anti-fat, fat phobia, and in real sort of derogation of fatness within the wider society, where fatness and what they found in these stories of people, attending a counselling session for the first time and seeing a counsellor who was fat, was that fatness was equated with a lack of psychological health on the part of the counsellor, and therefore the counsellor was rendered unfit and unable to assist the person with their problem that they went to seek counselling for. So I think it's a really kind of good example of how you can situate and theorize something about the real world meaning of this, connecting into what people might actually think if they were to seek counselling from a fat counsellor and how they might engage or disengage, but also situating that within the wider context of anti-fatness. In contrast to contextualist and essentialist perspectives, constructionist takes really don't theorize the inner psychology in any way, shape, or form of the writers, and indeed aren't particularly interested in the writers, but are interested in how meaning is created in the worlds that we live and exist within. So I, along with one of my former students, Annabelle MacDonald, used this approach in our analysis of the Chris healthy eating stories, which you had one example of and saw the stem earlier. And we were interested in exploring how the social phenomenon of healthy eating as a practice is constituted and made meaningful, essentially trying to get at the questions of what is healthy eating within people's everyday sense making, and what are the tensions or challenges that might exist in relation to this, and indeed the senses of kind of obligation or opportunity that exist within this space. And we know the wider societal context is one where healthy eating is a heavily produced public health strategy alongside people not eating appropriately or healthily in the right ways, and often decontextualized from the socio-structural contexts, including colonization practices, which have rendered healthy eating a unequally available practice to all. Not that I am even suggesting that we should simply all eat healthily in the ways that it gets promoted to us all the time. So this constructionist approach doesn't get into the heads of the writers. Instead, within this theorization of qualitative story completion data, the stories we generate tell us about how social phenomena are constructed and made meaningful, rather than about the beliefs and values, etc., of the participants themselves. So rather than treating story completion as a way of circumventing social desirability, the fictitious nature is seen to allow us to generate a diversity of narratives that can help us understand what's going on and what's at stake in the domain that we're interested in. Finally, the sort of new materialist or more than human approaches are sort of expanding and developing in this area, and they are interested in not understanding humans as independently, psychologically and physically embodied selves, but rather that we exist in relation to, and that's a mutually constitutive relation between objects and other things in the world. So the language is often theoretically complex if it's not your approach, but basically they argue for exploring co-constituted assemblages of the human and non-human, if in, with, and through stories, and consider what is made available through the ways people engage in these non-human and human worlds. So Deborah Lupton's research that I've got here on health information seeking is a nice and relatively accessible example of this type of approach, and generates an understanding of the sorts of things that might be at stake in relation to that. Lupton commented that the stories were evocative in describing the effective forces that were part of the protagonist's experiences in facing and seeking to resolve their health problems. The stories surfaced the ways in which humans and non-humans interrelated and the connections that were described between the various agents appearing in the stories. Many stories highlighted the vulnerability of the protagonists as they faced their health problem and sought to resolve it. The stories vividly describe feelings of distress and sadness and fear and anxiety and shame and guilt and embarrassment, and also the protagonist's relief and in some cases happiness when they resolved their problem. In some situations, the effective forces motivated action that helped the protagonist deal with their problem, but in others, effective forces limited positive action, such as shame or guilt or embarrassment, leading to delay in seeking professional help, or self-consciousness about a body, leading the protagonist to avoiding the gym and other forms of exercise in public. And so, importantly, they did not theorize this as just coming from internal into the person's head, but rather the sort of the context as producing possibilities as much as the person's psychology. Now, the take-home message from all of this is that you need to be clear how you are theorizing your data, because these approaches range from theorizing things about the storytellers to theorizing things about the worlds that we live in. And the claims we can make about these are very, very different. And if we have mismatches, anybody who listened to my talk yesterday, which hopefully made sense, will understand that mismatches is something I'm concerned about from a kind of quality point of view. If we have mismatches, I think our research is open to criticism. So we need to really think about what we're getting at if we're going to use this approach. And it does connect then to how we analyze the data. So I'm just going to quickly move on to that to finish up. So a lot of the approaches to analysis so far have been very conventional. They may be thematic or discourse approaches, and they look at horizontal patterning. So the stories contain repetitive tropes and meanings and so on that can be explored across the stories that we get. And some have started to touch on the possibility of narrative, exploring both the horizontal and vertical flows of meaning, but there is very little that has done that so far, and that's a sort of a key area for exploration. And then there are some which have looked at more vertically oriented analysis. So we've sort of looked at story mapping, which very kind of lightly maps kind of key points in a trajectory and what happens in these, what are the key sort of things at stake at different points in the story. And those within the kind of new materialist or post-humanist traditions have also used things like creative approaches to reporting the analysis, including poetic inquiry. And I thought I'd give an example of this because it's very evocative. And I'm going to use another example from Deborah Lupton's research. And Lupton describes how the stories were kind of so creative and rich and felt like they needed to be told in a poetic reporting way. And you'll see how kind of alive and engaged this is. And Victoria Clark sometimes comments that sometimes the data tell you how they need to be analysed. And I think this is a beautiful example of the data telling Deborah how they needed to be analysed. She says, I think they really convey the aliveness and vitality that is possible. I know Deborah says, the poetic representations articulate a strong sense of the effective atmosphere and the more than human worlds in which health and illness states are embodied, experienced, and communicate. And I think they convey the aliveness and vitality that's possible with story completion data and thus the interpretive potential of them. So let's look at one of these just before I finish up. So this is Isabel's story, and it's from research around kind of broadly health literacy, and you can go and read the article if you want. So Isabel has tried many things before, but has always lost heart, cannot exercise in public, hates gyms, always feels self-conscious, judged, shy, fat rolls to deal with, doesn't do lycra and protein shakes, a bit wary about competitive friends, finds way too much information online, so many blogs and stories on social media, crazy fad diets, celebrity stories, all the before and afters. Complicated life, it all seems too hard, more trouble than it is worth. Maybe being fat wasn't so bad. If only there was a magic pill for loving fitness. She asks around, decides to speak to her friends, asks them what they do, finds a walking group, a fitness trainer gives her some good advice, a step tracking app gives her motivation. What does health mean to me? Things that matter: walk, swim, dance, laugh, buy local veggies and cook them. She keeps walking absolutely everywhere, settled in, determined, makes some new friends, chooses contentment. I think a very poignant story about engaging in exercise in a context where we are increasingly responsibilized and obligated to embody our health in very particular types of ways. So really, I want to just finish up with an encouragement to consider adding story completion to your methodological toolkit for health knowledge production, and that it might be useful in a whole range of different situations, quite apart from just because you're interested and curious. I think it's good for us to ask ourselves, is kind of some traditional health report necessary? Do we want to try and get at meaning more indirectly? Are we interested in the things that are socially available to people rather than people's minds themselves? It can also be a really good method when we don't want to burden participants with a large task or a lot to do. This is a pretty short and brief way of engaging, and it is also it's also can be a lot of fun for participants. We've had a lot of positive feedback from people who've enjoyed the experience. And it can also help us get through, I guess, the ethics and practicalities of direct questioning when that may prove challenging. And there's a wide range of ways in which those approaches may not be appropriate in the context of the research. And it's also quite resource light. So it doesn't take a lot in order to do it. I'm not going to talk through these because listening to a talk is taxing, but there are challenges and considerations that we need to be thinking about as well. And if we're doing our research online, one of these is the emergence of generative AI and AI bots as potential participants. And this became really sort of apparent to Gibson and Beattie in their research, where they did rounds of data collection, and they noticed around data collection after generative AI, the stories felt off, the stories felt wrong, the stories didn't feel like the same as the others, and they were flagged with very high poor quality. And they appeared to be sort of right, but they weren't quite right. And so their paper is really interesting. It raises really interesting questions about I guess, the humanness of the storytellers in qualitative story completion. So just to finish up, story completion can generate really rich data, really unexpected data. It can be fun for participants and can circumvent some ethical challenges, but we do need to think about ethics. It can be really creative. I've emphasized written stories a lot, but it doesn't have to be written. And I think those other modes are really interesting and great ones to be exploring. And it's quick. It can be quick. It can be easy, but it doesn't have to be used just for those reasons. I'm very wary of just sort of going, do this. It's quick and easy, and we really have to choose methods that suit our context and suit our purpose. And that connects into really thinking about what we're getting at and why we're getting at it, and how important that is in our context. And that can be contexts that range from those where it's an individual researcher driving a research agenda through to more collaborative participatory approaches where our accountabilities are not to ourselves or not to research, but maybe to the communities that we operate within. And so exploring the possibilities of story completion across a range of different contexts is important, just as much as theorizing the data that we generate through those processes. And finally, think about this. Might this be something to try? Might this be something to explore? So, thank you very much for listening. I don't have the capacity to answer your questions or to hear your comments, and I finish up with again being really sorry I'm not there for the day. Our story completion website and some of the more recent publications that I've put out has a lot of advice and information around things like design and considerations. And so I'll just finish up here with a few starting resources for those of you who might be interested in exploring it from a range of different perspectives. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day. And I'm sorry again that I'm not there to be a physical part of that. Thank you.